Welcome to Askprep, your trusted destination for focused and effective learning. Today, we will study pandemics that changed human history, exploring how major outbreaks transformed societies, reshaped economies, influenced medical advancements, and altered the course of human civilization across different periods of time. A pandemic is not merely a health crisis, it is a powerful attack on humanity's social, economic, and emotional structures. It spreads silently across borders, affecting people regardless of nationality, class, or belief. Hospitals turn into battlegrounds where healthcare workers fight tirelessly to save lives, while fear and misinformation spread rapidly among populations. Daily life comes to a halt as lockdowns disrupt education, employment, and human interaction, creating widespread uncertainty and anxiety. Though a pandemic attacks humanity at its core, it also tests our resilience and our ability to unite in the face of a shared threat. Now, we will study and learn about some major pandemic attacks in history. The Plague of Athens stands as one of the earliest and most devastating pandemic outbreaks recorded in human history. It occurred in 430 BCE, during the second year of the Peloponnesian War, a prolonged and brutal conflict between Athens and Sparta. At the height of Athenian power, when the city-state believed itself invincible due to its navy, democratic institutions, and cultural dominance, an invisible enemy arrived, one that no army could defeat and no walls could keep out. This pandemic not only killed a large portion of Athens' population but also altered the psychological, political, and moral foundations of the ancient Greek world. To understand the significance of the Plague of Athens, it is essential to understand the context in which it emerged. Athens, under the leadership of Pericles, had adopted a defensive strategy against Sparta. Instead of fighting the Spartan land army directly, the Athenians withdrew behind their long walls, which connected the city to its port at Piraeus. This strategy allowed Athens to rely on naval power and imported food supplies while avoiding direct confrontation. However, this decision had an unintended consequence. Refugees from the countryside flooded into the city, leading to extreme overcrowding. Homes, temples, and public spaces became packed with people living in unsanitary conditions, creating the perfect environment for disease to spread. It was through the port of Piraeus that the plague is believed to have entered Athens. Ancient sources suggest that the disease may have originated in regions such as Ethiopia, Egypt, or Persia, traveling along trade routes before reaching the Greek world. The Athenians suspected enemy sabotage, believing the Spartans may have poisoned water sources, but there was no evidence to support this claim. What was clear, however, was that once the disease entered the city, it spread rapidly and mercilessly. What made the plague particularly terrifying was its unpredictability. Doctors were among the first to die because of their close contact with patients, and their inability to cure the disease destroyed public confidence in medicine. Religious practices also failed. Prayers, sacrifices, and visits to oracles brought no relief. As faith in the gods weakened, many Athenians began to believe that divine order itself had collapsed. The political impact of the plague was equally severe. Athens lost an estimated one-third of its population, including soldiers, sailors, and citizens essential to the functioning of the state. Most significantly, the plague claimed the life of Pericles, the leader whose vision and restraint had guided Athens through its golden age. After his death, Athens lacked stable leadership. More aggressive and less disciplined politicians rose to power, contributing to strategic mistakes that would eventually lead to Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The plague also affected Athens' military strength. Hoplite soldiers and robbers died in large numbers, weakening both land and naval forces. Morale collapsed, and the belief in Athenian superiority faded. While Sparta did not suffer from the same outbreak, it also avoided prolonged sieges of Athens out of fear of the disease, showing how pandemics can influence even enemy strategies. Despite uncertainty about the pathogen, the Plague of Athens remains crucial for understanding how societies respond to pandemics. It reveals patterns that repeat throughout history: fear, misinformation, breakdown of trust, collapse of institutions, and long-term psychological trauma. Thucydides' account emphasizes that pandemics are not merely medical events, they are social and political crises that test the resilience of civilizations. The psychological impact of the plague cannot be overstated. Constant exposure to death created a sense of hopelessness. Survivors were often traumatized, having lost family members, friends, and social networks. Yet paradoxically, those who recovered from the disease were believed to be immune, and they were often tasked with caring for the sick. This early recognition of immunity is one of the first recorded observations of acquired resistance to disease. The Plague of Athens also changed the way history was written. Thucydides approached the outbreak not as a divine punishment, but as a phenomenon that could be observed, recorded, and analyzed. He deliberately avoided attributing the disease to the anger of the gods, marking a shift toward rational, empirical thinking. This approach influenced later historians and laid early foundations for scientific historiography. In a broader sense, the pandemic weakened Athens at a critical moment, altering the balance of power in the Greek world. Had the plague not occurred, Athens might have maintained its dominance longer or even won the Peloponnesian War. Instead, the city entered a slow decline, eventually losing its empire and political independence. The plague thus became a turning point in ancient history. The relevance of the Plague of Athens extends far beyond antiquity. Modern pandemics, including influenza outbreaks, Ebola, and COVID-19, reflect similar challenges: overcrowding, misinformation, strain on healthcare systems, fear-driven behavior, and social inequality. The Athenian experience reminds us that technological advancement and cultural sophistication do not make societies immune to biological threats. In conclusion, the Plague of Athens was not just a medical disaster, it was a civilizational shock. It exposed the vulnerability of even the most powerful societies, reshaped political leadership, weakened moral structures, and changed the course of history. Through the careful observations of Thucydides, this ancient pandemic continues to speak to the modern world, reminding humanity that disease can be as decisive as war, and that the strength of a society lies not only in its armies and walls, but in its ability to respond collectively, rationally, and humanely in times of crisis. The Antonine Plague, also known as the Plague of Galen, was one of the most devastating pandemics in the history of the Roman Empire. It began around 165 CE and continued for more than a decade, returning in waves until approximately 180 CE. At the height of Roman power, when the empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia and seemed unshakable in its military, administrative, and cultural strength, this pandemic struck at the very heart of imperial stability. Unlike a sudden battlefield defeat, the Antonine Plague worked silently, weakening Rome from within and leaving long-lasting consequences that reshaped the empire's future. The outbreak is believed to have originated in the eastern provinces of the empire, possibly in Mesopotamia or along trade routes connecting Rome to Asia. Roman soldiers returning from campaigns against the Parthian Empire are thought to have carried the disease back with them. As these troops moved across the empire, through Asia Minor, Greece, Italy, Gaul, and North Africa, the infection traveled with alarming speed. Rome's vast road network and dense urban centers, usually symbols of imperial efficiency, became channels for the rapid spread of disease. The demographic impact of the Antonine Plague was catastrophic. Entire villages were depopulated, farms were abandoned, and urban centers experienced severe labor shortages. The Roman economy, which depended heavily on agricultural production and taxation, began to suffer. With fewer farmers to work the land, food production declined. Tax revenues fell, putting strain on the imperial treasury. Inflation increased, and the state struggled to pay soldiers and maintain public infrastructure. The Roman army was particularly affected. Soldiers lived in close quarters, making them highly vulnerable to infection. Entire legions were weakened or wiped out, reducing Rome's ability to defend its borders. This military weakness emboldened external enemies and forced the empire to recruit soldiers from less reliable sources, including mercenaries and barbarian tribes. Over time, this shift would have profound consequences for Roman military discipline and cohesion. The social fabric of Roman society also began to fray under the pressure of constant death. Fear and uncertainty dominated daily life. Traditional religious rituals failed to stop the spread of the disease, leading many to question the protection of the gods. Public sacrifices and ceremonies increased, but when they brought no relief, skepticism grew. Some people turned to superstition, magic, or foreign cults in search of protection, while others abandoned religious practices altogether. The Antonine Plague struck during the reign of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, often remembered as the Philosopher King and one of Rome's most capable rulers. Despite his stoic beliefs in duty, rationality, and acceptance of fate, Marcus Aurelius faced challenges unlike any Rome had encountered before. He personally organized relief efforts, attempted to stabilize the economy, and continued military campaigns along the empire's frontiers. However, even his leadership could not fully counter the damage caused by the pandemic. In 180 CE, Marcus Aurelius himself died, possibly as a result of the plague, marking the end of a period of relative stability known as the Pax Romana. From a medical perspective, the Antonine Plague exposed the limitations of ancient medicine. Despite Galen's advanced understanding of anatomy and physiology for his time, there was little that physicians could do to treat the disease. Treatments were largely based on balancing bodily humors, using herbal remedies, bloodletting, and dietary adjustments. The failure of these methods reinforced the sense of helplessness and highlighted the need for more systematic approaches to public health, an idea that would take centuries to develop. The long-term consequences of the Antonine Plague were far-reaching. The loss of population reduced economic productivity and weakened administrative systems. The empire became increasingly dependent on authoritarian measures to maintain order, including higher taxes and stricter controls on labor. These pressures contributed to social unrest and laid the groundwork for later crises, including the 3rd century collapse of Roman stability. The Justinian Plague was one of the deadliest and most destructive pandemic attacks ever recorded in human history, and it is widely regarded as the first true pandemic known to mankind. It first appeared in the year 541 AD and continued to return in multiple waves for nearly 2 centuries, finally disappearing around 750 AD. This pandemic occurred during the reign of Emperor Justinian I, a ruler whose ambitions and reforms had once promised a golden future for his empire. However, instead of prosperity and expansion, his reign became forever associated with one of the greatest biological disasters the world had ever seen. The plague spread across vast regions of Europe, Asia, and North Africa, killing millions of people and leaving a deep scar on global history. Before the outbreak, the world of the 6th century was experiencing growth, stability, and increasing connectivity. The Byzantine Empire was the most powerful political and economic force of its time. Its capital, Constantinople, was a thriving metropolis with grand palaces, massive markets, and a dense population. Emperor Justinian aimed to restore the ancient Roman Empire by reconquering lost territories, strengthening laws, and promoting architecture and culture. Trade routes connected distant lands, allowing goods, ideas, and wealth to flow freely. Unfortunately, these same connections later became the channels through which the deadly disease traveled rapidly from one region to another. Historians believe that the Justinian plague originated either in Central Asia or in parts of Africa, where the bacterium responsible for the disease existed among rodent populations. The plague spread through fleas that lived on rats, which were commonly found on merchant ships and in grain storage areas. Egypt, being the main supplier of grain to Constantinople, played a crucial role in transporting infected rats and fleas to the heart of the empire. Once the disease reached major cities, it spread with terrifying speed due to overcrowding, poor hygiene, and the complete absence of medical knowledge about infectious diseases. When the plague struck Constantinople, it created scenes of unimaginable horror. Contemporary historians described streets filled with corpses and homes where entire families had died. At the height of the outbreak, it is estimated that between 5,000 and 10,000 people were dying every day in the city. Some sources even suggest that nearly 40% of the population was wiped out in a very short period of time. The disease showed no mercy and affected all sections of society, including laborers, merchants, soldiers, religious leaders, and government officials. Even the emperor himself fell seriously ill, proving that no one was safe from the pandemic. Fear dominated society as people struggled to understand the cause of the disease. Many believed the plague was a punishment sent by God for human sins, while others thought it was a sign of the approaching end of the world. Religious rituals increased, with people gathering in large crowds to pray and seek forgiveness. Ironically, these gatherings made the situation worse by increasing human contact and spreading the disease further. Burial systems collapsed, graveyards overflowed, and mass graves were created. In some cases, bodies were stacked in abandoned buildings or left in the open because there were not enough healthy people to bury the dead. The economic impact of the Justinian plague was devastating and long-lasting. With millions of people dead, agriculture suffered greatly as farms were abandoned and food production declined. Trade networks collapsed due to the lack of workers and fear of infection. Labor shortages caused wages to rise, but inflation and scarcity made survival difficult for ordinary people. Government tax revenues dropped sharply, weakening the state's ability to maintain infrastructure, public services, and military forces. As a result, the empire slowly lost its strength and stability. The social structure of society also changed dramatically. Entire communities disappeared, traditional family systems were destroyed, and migration increased as survivors fled infected areas. The psychological impact of the plague created a culture of fear, uncertainty, and pessimism. Many people lost faith in institutions, while others became more deeply religious. The constant return of plague waves over generations meant that society never fully recovered its earlier population levels or economic strength. Many historians believe that the Justinian plague played a major role in altering the course of world history. It weakened the Byzantine Empire at a critical moment and prevented Justinian from fully achieving his dream of restoring the Roman Empire. The population decline and economic collapse contributed to political instability and made regions more vulnerable to invasions and external threats. Some scholars argue that this pandemic marked the beginning of the end of the ancient world and paved the way for the medieval era. The Black Death was one of the most catastrophic pandemic attacks in human history and is considered the deadliest disease outbreak ever recorded. It struck Europe, Asia, and North Africa between 1347 and 1351, wiping out an estimated one-third to one-half of Europe's population within just a few years. This pandemic did not spread slowly over centuries like some diseases. Instead, it moved with terrifying speed, turning lively cities into graveyards and completely transforming medieval society. The Black Death was not just a health crisis but a civilizational shock that changed human thinking, social structures, economies, and religious beliefs forever. Before the Black Death appeared, medieval Europe was already under stress. The population had grown rapidly, cities were overcrowded, sanitation was extremely poor, and medical knowledge was almost non-existent. Most people lived in close contact with animals, waste was thrown into the streets, and clean water was rare. Trade routes connected Europe with Asia through land and sea, bringing wealth and goods, but also unknowingly creating perfect pathways for disease transmission. This fragile balance of society meant that once the plague arrived, it spread uncontrollably. Historians believe that the Black Death originated in Central Asia and traveled westward along the Silk Road. Merchant caravans and ships carried infected rats and fleas from Asia to the ports of Europe. In 1347, trading ships reached ports in Italy, carrying not only spices and silk but also death itself. Within months, the disease spread from port cities to the countryside and then across the entire continent. Every major trade hub became a center of infection, proving how interconnected the medieval world had already become. The disease responsible for the Black Death was the same bacterium that caused the earlier Justinian plague. It spread primarily through flea bites, but it could also spread through the air when it took a pneumonic form. This made the Black Death even more terrifying, as people could become infected simply by being near the sick. The speed of transmission created widespread panic, and people had no understanding of germs or infection control, making prevention almost impossible. Medical responses to the Black Death were ineffective and often harmful. Doctors relied on ancient theories of imbalanced bodily fluids and believed that bad air, or miasma, caused the disease. Treatments included bloodletting, burning herbs, wearing scented masks, and applying leeches, none of which worked. Some cities attempted quarantine measures, isolating ships and travelers for 40 days, a practice that later became known as quarantine. While limited in effectiveness, these were among the first organized public health responses in history. The economic impact of the Black Death was enormous and long-lasting. With millions dead, there was a severe shortage of labor. Farms were left unattended, food production declined, and trade slowed dramatically. However, for survivors, wages increased due to labor scarcity, giving peasants and workers more bargaining power. This weakened the feudal system and gradually shifted economic power away from landowners toward laborers, setting the stage for major social and economic changes in Europe. The Black Death fundamentally changed the course of history. It accelerated the decline of feudalism, transformed economies, reshaped cities, and altered social hierarchies. Population decline led to innovation, as societies searched for ways to produce more with fewer people. Over time, these changes contributed to the rise of the Renaissance and the modern world. In this sense, the Black Death was both a tragedy and a catalyst for transformation. In conclusion, the Black Death was not merely a disease outbreak but a defining event in human history. It exposed the weaknesses of medieval society, demonstrated the destructive power of pandemics, and reshaped the world in lasting ways. The lessons of the Black Death remind us that fear, misinformation, and social division can be as dangerous as the disease itself, and that humanity's survival depends not only on medical knowledge but also on compassion, cooperation, and understanding. Cholera is one of the most important and deadly infectious diseases in human history, and unlike sudden plague outbreaks, it represents a pandemic threat closely linked with water, sanitation, and human behavior. Cholera has appeared in multiple global pandemics since the early 19th century and continues to affect millions of people even today, especially in regions with poor access to clean drinking water. Caused by the bacterium *Vibrio cholerae*, cholera spreads rapidly through contaminated water and food, leading to severe dehydration and death if untreated. The history of cholera is not just the story of a disease, but also the story of urbanization, poverty, colonialism, scientific discovery, and the birth of modern public health. Before cholera became a global threat, it was largely confined to the Ganges Delta region of the Indian subcontinent. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, rapid population growth, expanding trade, and colonial military movement allowed the disease to escape its original geographic boundaries. The first cholera pandemic began around 1817 and spread from India to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. Over the next 100 years, cholera would return again and again in powerful waves, causing fear across continents and killing millions of people worldwide. One of the most infamous cholera outbreaks occurred in London in 1854. At that time, most doctors believed that diseases spread through bad air, known as the miasma theory. However, a physician named John Snow challenged this belief. By carefully mapping cholera cases, he discovered that most victims were using water from a single public pump on Broad Street. When the pump handle was removed, the outbreak slowed dramatically. This discovery became a turning point in medical history and laid the foundation for modern epidemiology, proving that contaminated water, not air, was the main cause of cholera transmission. The symptoms of cholera are sudden and severe. Infected individuals develop intense watery diarrhea, vomiting, muscle cramps, and rapid loss of body fluids. The stool often looks like rice water, a distinctive sign of the disease. Without treatment, dehydration can become so extreme that patients die within hours. During historical outbreaks, mortality rates were extremely high because doctors did not understand how to replace lost fluids effectively. Today, simple oral rehydration therapy can save lives, but in the past, cholera was often a death sentence. Cholera pandemics had a particularly devastating impact on colonial regions such as British India, where poverty, famine, and lack of infrastructure made populations extremely vulnerable. Millions died during repeated outbreaks, and colonial authorities often failed to invest in sanitation for native populations. pilgrimages, military movements, and trade routes further accelerated the spread of disease. Cholera became a symbol of inequality, showing how social and political systems can determine who lives and who dies during a health crisis. The economic and social consequences of cholera were significant. Trade slowed as ports were closed, cities lost workers, and governments faced pressure to invest in sanitation infrastructure. Over time, cholera outbreaks directly contributed to the development of modern sewer systems, water filtration, and public health departments. The disease transformed how societies understood health, shifting responsibility from individual morality to environmental and structural factors. Unlike many historical pandemics, cholera has never completely disappeared. It remains endemic in parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, particularly in areas affected by war, natural disasters, or extreme poverty. Modern outbreaks often follow floods, earthquakes, or refugee crises, where clean water systems collapse. This makes cholera not just a medical issue, but a humanitarian and political challenge that reflects global inequality. Smallpox was one of the most terrifying and deadly diseases in human history, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of millions of people over thousands of years. For centuries, smallpox shaped human civilization by influencing population growth, warfare, colonization, and medical science. Unlike many pandemics that appeared suddenly and disappeared over time, smallpox remained a constant global threat, spreading across continents and generations. Caused by the variola virus, smallpox was highly contagious and deadly, and for most of human history, there was no effective treatment or cure. Historical evidence suggests that smallpox existed as early as ancient Egypt, with signs of the disease found on mummies. From there, it spread across Asia, Europe, and Africa through trade routes, migration, and military campaigns. As civilizations became more connected, smallpox followed human movement, thriving in crowded cities and settlements. Repeated outbreaks caused massive loss of life, particularly among children, and survivors were often left with permanent scars or blindness, making the disease both physically and psychologically devastating. Smallpox spread mainly through close human contact. The virus passed from person to person through respiratory droplets, physical touch, or contaminated objects such as clothing and bedding. Once infected, individuals developed fever, severe body pain, and exhaustion, followed by a characteristic rash that turned into pus-filled blisters. These blisters eventually scabbed over and left deep scars on the skin. In its most severe form, the disease killed around 30% of those infected, and in some outbreaks, the mortality rate was even higher. The discovery of vaccination transformed medicine and public health. Over time, vaccination programs spread across Europe and other parts of the world, significantly reducing smallpox deaths. Governments began to recognize the importance of mass immunization, although resistance and fear of vaccines were common. Despite opposition, vaccination gradually proved its effectiveness, saving countless lives and setting the foundation for modern immunology. In conclusion, smallpox was more than just a disease. It was a force that shaped empires, destroyed populations, and transformed medicine. Its eventual eradication stands as one of humanity's greatest victories over nature. Studying the history of smallpox reminds us that while diseases can be devastating, scientific progress and collective action can change the fate of the entire world. Thank you for being a valued part of Askprep. Your continuous support and trust motivate us to create meaningful, reliable, and high-quality educational content every day. We are committed to guiding you through your learning journey and helping you achieve your academic and career goals.